He bought the cabin because no one else wanted it. The listing was old, almost forgotten, buried beneath properties sold in a hurry, and parcels labeled as not worth the trouble. There were no recent photos, no bright descriptions, just a few dry lines that said more by what they omitted than by what they explained. Wooden cabin, isolated area, difficult access, no mention of neighbors, no mention of history. For a recently retired ex-soldier, that wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. For most of his life, he had existed inside noise, engines, commands, radios crackling with urgency. Silence had always come later, after things were already decided. When retirement finally arrived, the quiet felt unfamiliar, even heavy. He didn't want comfort. He didn't want people. He wanted distance, a place where nothing expected anything from him. The dirt road ended sooner than the map suggested. The rest of the journey was on foot, a light pack on his back and decades of habit in the way he moved. The forest closed in gradually, as if testing whether he truly meant to keep going. Tall trees, old ground, a kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, just reserved. When the cabin finally came into view, it didn't look abandoned. It looked like it had been waiting. The wood was weathered but solid. The porch leaned slightly like a tired knee that had learned to carry weight without complaint. There were faint marks in the dirt, old, but not erased. He noticed them. He always noticed things others missed. Observation had once kept him alive. Still, he felt no fear. Inside, the air smelled of dust and dry leaves. There was no furniture, no signs of recent life, but there were traces of something unfinished. An empty shelf in the corner. A crooked nail near the door, as if something important had been taken down in a hurry. The place held the silence of absence, not neglect, but interruption. He spent the night there. Sleep came lightly, not restless, but alert. The forest had its own language, branches shifting, distant sounds too vague to name. At some point before dawn, he woke with the unsettling sense that the silence had changed. It no longer felt passive, it felt aware. Morning arrived slowly. Pale light filtered through the cracks in the wood, touching the walls as if inspecting them. He stepped onto the porch, breathed in the cold air, and for the first time allowed himself to think he might have made the right decision. That was when he realized he wasn't alone. There were no footsteps, no voices, just a presence, unmistakable, sudden. Several yards from the cabin, two figures stood motionless. They didn't approach. They didn't call out. They waited calmly, as if time itself were on their side. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. Two women, young, composed. Their expressions were too steady for chance visitors, too certain. One of them stepped forward, and with the quiet authority of someone who doesn't need permission, she said the words that would change that morning, and everything that followed, forever. The cabin, she said, had never been abandoned. He didn't argue with them. Not at first. When the two women spoke, he listened the way he had been trained to listen years ago, without interrupting, without reacting too quickly. Their voices were calm, not hostile, not apologetic either. They spoke as people who weren't trying to convince him of anything. They didn't raise their tone, they didn't ask him to leave. They simply stated what they believed to be true. This land was never abandoned, one of them said. And it was never sold, the other added. He looked past them toward the forest behind the cabin. The trees stood close together, old and quiet, their branches barely moving in the morning air. No fence marked the property, no signs, no warnings, nothing that suggested ownership, at least not in the way the modern world understood it. He reached into his jacket and slowly pulled out the folded papers he had carried since the purchase. Deeds, maps, official stamps. He held them out, not aggressively, not defensively, simply as facts. "I bought it legally," he said. They didn't touch the documents. They didn't even glance at them for long. One of the women nodded, as if she had expected that answer. The other studied his face instead. Not his hands, not the papers, but his eyes. As if she were trying to place him inside a much older story. "You bought what they were allowed to sell," she said quietly. "Not what was taken." The words landed heavier than he expected. He had heard arguments like that before, usually shouted, usually followed by anger. This was different. There was no accusation in her voice, just certainty. They told him they weren't there to remove him that morning. Not yet. They said they wanted him to understand where he was standing. What this place had been long before maps gave it a name. Long before roads ended abruptly and listings disappeared into obscurity. He listened. Against his instincts, he listened. They spoke of families who once lived near the creek, of paths that no longer existed, of a clearing where ceremonies had been held for generations. They didn't say how it was lost. They didn't need to. He knew enough history to fill in the silence himself. When they finished, neither of them asked him a question. They turned and walked back toward the trees, stopping only once. "We'll return," one of them said. "Tomorrow." And then they were gone. The forest swallowed them with unsettling ease. For a long moment he stood alone in front of the cabin, papers still in his hand, the words echoing louder than the quiet around him. He folded the documents carefully and placed them back inside his jacket, as if order might restore clarity. It didn't. He spent the rest of the morning walking the land. He followed the edge of the clearing, then pushed deeper into the trees. The ground changed subtly beneath his boots, firmer in some places, softer in others. He noticed old depressions that didn't belong to animals, stones arranged too deliberately to be natural, faded traces that suggested movement, repetition, purpose. Nothing recent, but nothing accidental either. By midday he found what looked like the remains of a path. Narrow, overgrown. It curved away from the cabin and vanished near the creek. He knelt beside it, running his fingers over the soil. It had been used, frequently, long ago. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. During his service, he had stood on land that technically belonged to one side, morally to another, and practically to whoever arrived last. He had followed orders. He had trusted maps. He had accepted documents as truth because they simplified decisions that were otherwise impossible to carry. He had told himself those choices belonged to the past. That night sleep didn't come easily. The forest seemed closer now, the sounds more deliberate. Wind passed through the trees like quiet movement. At one point he thought he heard footsteps, not approaching, not retreating, simply circling. When he stepped outside with a flashlight, there was nothing. Just darkness and the soft glow of the cabin behind him. He sat on the porch for a long time. He told himself he could leave. He could contact the authorities. He could fight this through paperwork and patience. Legally, he was protected. That much was clear. But clarity didn't bring peace. As the hours passed, one thought refused to leave him. If this place truly meant nothing to them, they wouldn't have come themselves. They would have sent someone else. When dawn finally approached, he realized the silence no longer felt empty at all. It felt expectant. And he knew that when the women returned, he would no longer be deciding whether to stay. He would be deciding what kind of man he still was. They returned just after sunrise. He knew they would. Not because they had threatened him. They hadn't. But because their departure the day before hadn't felt like an ending. It had felt like a pause. The light was different that morning, clearer, sharper. The forest no longer hid behind mist or shadow. Everything stood exposed, including the cabin, the clearing, and the narrow stretch of land he had begun to think of as his. He stepped outside before they arrived, as if standing on the porch first might help him understand where he belonged in the scene. He heard them this time. Soft footsteps, measured, unhurried. They emerged from the trees at the same place as before, stopping at the edge of the clearing. The distance between them was deliberate, far enough to show restraint, close enough to make their presence undeniable. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence stretched, not awkward, intentional. "You came back," he said at last. "We said we would," one of them replied. He noticed things he hadn't the day before. Their clothes were simple, practical, worn by use rather than decoration. Their expressions carried none of the tension he felt tightening his shoulders. If anything, they looked prepared, not for conflict but for explanation. He gestured toward the cabin behind him. "I walked the land," he said. "I saw the path near the creek, the stones. I know this place meant something." The woman on the left nodded slowly. "It still does." He took a breath. "Then why wasn't anyone here?" They exchanged a glance, brief, loaded with something unspoken. "Because being forced away doesn't mean forgetting," the other woman said. "And absence doesn't mean surrender." He didn't respond right away. He was aware of how carefully he was choosing his words, how much of his past training had returned without his permission. Assess, measure, control. "I didn't take this from you," he said finally. "I bought it." "We know," she replied. "That doesn't change what it is." He felt the frustration rise then, not anger, but the exhaustion of standing between two truths that refused to acknowledge each other. He could prove his claim in court. He could point to signatures and stamps and dates. He could reduce this entire conversation to legality. Instead, he asked a question he hadn't planned to ask. "What do you want?" The women didn't answer immediately. "We want you to understand," one said at last, "before you decide what comes next." "Decide what?" he asked. "Whether you stay," she said. "And how?" That unsettled him more than any demand would have. They told him more that morning. Not everything, but enough to change the shape of what he thought he knew. About the families who had lived along the creek until access was quietly restricted. About promises made in offices far from the forest. About land reclassified, redrawn, and sold without those who lived on it ever being present. They never used the word stolen. They didn't have to. At one point he asked why they had come themselves instead of sending lawyers, officials, or protesters. "Because this isn't about winning," one of them said. "It's about whether you'll listen." The simplicity of the answer disarmed him. Before leaving, they made one thing clear. They weren't asking him to leave immediately. They weren't threatening him. But they were beginning a process, one that would bring attention to the land, to its history, and to anyone who stood on it. "You won't be invisible here anymore," one of them said. They turned to leave, then stopped. "There's something else you should know," the woman added. "This place was chosen carefully, not by you, by others." "For what?" he asked. She hesitated, just long enough to suggest the weight of what she was about to say. "Because some people believed it would be easier if no one ever came back." They disappeared into the trees again, leaving the clearing unnaturally quiet. The words stayed with him long after they were gone. He spent the afternoon inside the cabin, going through the papers again. Every document was legitimate, every transfer clean, no legal flaw, no obvious deceit. Whoever had sold the land had known exactly what they were doing, and so had whoever had bought it. By evening, he had made a list of options, all of them practical, all of them familiar. Fight it, delay it, outsource it, let systems handle what conscience complicated. He could already hear the arguments he would make. He had made them before, to himself, to others, to justify choices that seemed necessary at the time. As the sun dipped behind the trees, he stepped outside once more. The forest felt closer again, not threatening but watchful, like a witness that had seen many men arrive with certainty and leave with questions. That night, he slept less than the one before, not because of fear, but because something had begun to take shape in his mind, a realization he wasn't ready to face yet, that staying would cost him something, and that leaving might cost him even more. He didn't plan to go looking for answers that day. The intention had been simple: clear his head, organize his thoughts, decide on a next move. but answers have a way of surfacing when you stop trying to avoid them. And by mid-morning, the forest had begun to feel less like a refuge and more like a reminder. He followed the narrow path again, the one that curved away from the cabin and disappeared near the creek. In the daylight, it was easier to see how deliberate it was, how many feet must have passed over it, how many years it must have taken to form. This wasn't a trail created by convenience. It was a route shaped by habit, memory, and repetition. Near the water, he noticed something he had missed before. A series of wooden posts, half-rotted, barely visible beneath moss and vines. They formed a rough boundary, uneven and old, nothing like the fences he was used to seeing. There were no wires, no signs, just markers, quiet declarations meant for people who already knew what they meant. He stood there longer than he realized. During his service, boundaries had been everything: lines on maps, perimeters secured by force, zones declared cleared because paperwork said so. He had learned early on that the fastest way to survive was to trust those lines, even when the ground beneath his boots told a different story. That trust had cost others more than it had ever cost him. He returned to the cabin and pulled out his documents again, spreading them across the rough wooden table. The names blurred together. Corporations, agencies, transfers made decades apart, each one further removed from the people who had once lived there. One name stopped him cold. It wasn't familiar because of where he had seen it, but because of when. He recognized it from an operation years earlier, one he hadn't thought about in a long time. A relocation project framed as humanitarian, strategic, necessary. He remembered the briefing room, the clean language, the assurances that no one would be harmed. He remembered the villages being emptied. At the time, he had believed it, or told himself he did. The realization settled slowly, like something heavy sinking into place. This land hadn't just been taken. It had been cleared, and he had been part of systems that made that word feel acceptable. That afternoon, the women returned. They didn't approach the cabin right away. Instead, they waited near the edge of the clearing, giving him time, or perhaps seeing if he would come to them. He did. They noticed the change in him immediately, the way his shoulders carried weight differently now, the way his eyes searched the forest before meeting theirs. "You found something," one of them said. "Yes," he replied. "I think I did." He told them what he had discovered, not in detail, not defensively, just enough to show that he understood the scope of what had happened and his indirect connection to it. They listened without interruption. When he finished, there was no anger in their response, only something heavier. "Many men arrive here believing this place is quiet," one of them said. "They don't realize it's only patient." He asked them about the people who had lived there, about what happened after the relocation, about who had stayed, who had left, and who had never returned. They told him what they knew and what they didn't. Some families had been moved to land that couldn't sustain them. Others had scattered, trying to hold on to fragments of what they'd lost. A few had stayed nearby, watching from a distance, waiting for a moment when being seen wouldn't cost them everything again. "This cabin," the woman said, gesturing behind him, "was never meant to be permanent. It was a place of return." "For whom?" he asked. "For anyone willing to remember." The words struck deeper than he expected. That evening he walked the property again, this time not as an owner but as a guest. The forest no longer felt neutral. It felt layered, stories pressed beneath every step, every sound. He realized then that this wasn't about legality. It never had been. It was about choice. He could still fight, still stay, still claim what the law said was his. No one would stop him immediately. Systems would protect him. They always did. But he knew something now that he hadn't before. If he stayed without acknowledging what the land represented, he would become one more man who benefited from forgetting. That night, he sat on the porch long after dark, listening to the forest breathe around him. He thought about the orders he had followed, the moments he had justified, the belief that distance in time erased responsibility. He had spent his life being told where to stand. This was the first time he had been asked to decide why. As the fireflies flickered near the trees and the night settled fully in, he understood what the women meant when they said this place had been chosen carefully, not as a hiding place, but as a test, and whatever decision he made next would define more than where he slept. It would define who he was willing to be, now that no one was giving him orders anymore. The decision didn't come all at once. It never does. He woke before dawn, long before the forest stirred. The cabin was cold, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that settles only when something is about to change. He sat on the edge of the bed, boots already on, as if part of him had known sleep would be pointless. For years, decisions had been made for him, orders handed down, objectives outlined, consequences absorbed later. Responsibility in those days was shared, diluted by structure. Now there was no structure, no chain of command, no one to blame, only choice. He brewed coffee on a small burner and drank it slowly on the porch, watching the light creep through the trees. The forest didn't feel hostile. It felt attentive, like it was waiting to see whether he would repeat what so many others had done before him. By mid-morning, the women arrived. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They walked closer, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement. They could see it in his posture. The hesitation had changed shape. It was no longer defensive. It was deliberate. "I won't fight this," he said before either of them spoke. They didn't react immediately. Years of restraint had taught them not to trust words too quickly. "I could," he continued. "Legally, I mean. I could stay here for a long time. Long enough to make this difficult. Long enough to make it expensive." "Yes," one of them said. "We know." "But I won't," he said. "Not like that." They waited. "I didn't come here to win something," he said. "I came here to disappear, and I don't think that's possible anymore." The woman who had spoken most often studied him carefully. "Then what are you offering?" He took a breath. "Time, space, and the cabin." The words settled into the clearing like a held breath finally released. He explained his plan slowly, carefully. Not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to be understood. He would remain for a short while, just long enough to transfer the property into a trust. One that recognized the land's history, one that prevented future sale or development. The cabin would be restored, but not modernized. It would serve as a place of gathering, not ownership. "I'll leave when it's done," he said, quietly. The women exchanged a glance. This time there was something new in it, not suspicion, not relief, but consideration. "And you?" one of them asked. "What do you take with you?" He thought about that. "I take the part of this that belongs to me," he said finally. "The responsibility." They nodded. Not in gratitude, in acknowledgement. The days that followed moved quickly. Phone calls were made, documents drafted. A lawyer arrived once, confused but professional, asking questions that didn't fit neatly into the usual boxes. The women were present for every conversation, not to argue, but to ensure nothing was erased again through omission. The forest watched it all. On his final evening at the cabin, he packed lightly. He left behind tools he had brought, supplies he no longer needed. He cleaned the space thoroughly, not because it was required, but because it felt right. Before leaving, he stood in the center of the empty room, listening to the quiet one last time. It felt different now. Complete. At dawn, the women met him at the porch. "You don't have to go far," one of them said. "If you ever want to return," he shook his head. "Some places are meant to be visited once." They walked with him to the edge of the clearing. There were no speeches, no ceremony, just the understanding that something rare had happened. Not a victory, but a correction. As he stepped onto the narrow path leading away from the cabin, he paused. "I spent most of my life following lines drawn by other people," he said. "This is the first time I've stepped back from one." The woman smiled faintly. Sometimes stepping back is how land is returned. He left without looking back. Months later, the cabin stood much as it always had, quiet, unchanged to the casual eye. But those who knew its history came back, carefully, respectfully. The path near the creek grew clearer again, not wider, just remembered. And somewhere else, a retired ex-soldier began a different kind of life. One without uniforms, without orders, but with something he had not carried before. Peace that didn't require forgetting. Because the hardest battles he had learned too late were never about holding ground. They were about knowing when to give it back.